The worship of YHVH, North versus South. Well, that is what we're going to be studying today. The worship. We're going to deal with the North today, and then we'll deal with the South, see how the South worshipped this deity. But off the bat, no, they did not worship this deity the same. Remember, these are two separate territories, two different territories. They were never twins. They were never brothers coming from one womb. That is the theological narrative. These are two separate territories, two separate entities, two separate kingdoms, and they did do things differently. Even how they worship a deity that they all gave reference to. Okay, so when YHVH entered Jerusalem, remember he was in the north first. The Shasu introduced him to the north, and then the north. I wouldn't say the north introduced the south to Yahweh, but it was brought to the south. Let me put it that way. So when YHVH entered Jerusalem, he was not initially seen as the principal god. He wasn't the patron, the chief deity. He was not. Jerusalem had its deity. Yahweh is added to this deity. Someday we would look deeper into this, talking about the architecture of the temple in Jerusalem. And you would understand it more clearly. Why you had the Holy of Holies, the three chambers, outer court, inner court, Holy of Holies. We'll explain, you see how it makes sense. Was Yahweh, when he was introduced into Jerusalem, was he the one in the Holy of Holies? Or there was somebody there? Was he in the inner court? We will look into that just to put a bug in your ears or in your spirit. So when YHVH entered Jerusalem, he was not initially seen as the principal god. Instead, it wasn't until two kingdoms laid claim to him centuries later that he gained recognition and became their chief deity. So he became their chief deity in Jerusalem later on. The initial stages, when he was introduced or when he came into Jerusalem, he was not the chief deity at all. Now, contrary to what is said in the books of Kings, evidence suggests that the worship of YHVH in the north was quite different from that of the south. They worshipped this deity differently. Let's do a little summary of what we know. According to the Deuteronomistic authors, according to these authors, YHVH had to be worshipped exclusively, and sacrifices were centralized in Jerusalem. This is what we read when we read the biblical text, the Book of Kings, from the Deuteronomistic lens. However, this does not reflect the historical reality of the time. The time that we are talking about, when the north was a distinct entity by itself and the south was a distinct entity by itself, worship of Yahweh is not centralized in Jerusalem. So, what we read and we think that, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. If Yahweh is not worshipped in Jerusalem, it's false, it's wrong, it's idolatry. It's not a historical account. The concept of YHVH being the sole deity and Jerusalem being its only legitimate sanctuary is thought to have arisen in the 7th century at earliest. So anyone who says Jerusalem is the sole place, the person is in the 7th century. The time that we are talking about predates this. We are looking at historical accounts. Now, I can, without knowing, we do know now, but without knowing, one can ask, but why was the same national god, national deity, worshipped in both kingdoms? How did they come to share the same deity? We already know the answer to that, so I won't go into details. What I would want to focus on is rather how two peoples, how two territories can share a deity. Was it common? Was it uncommon in the Levant, in the ancient Near East? Not at all. The worship of shared gods was not uncommon in the Levant, with El and YHVH being two of the most common deities. These are good examples, YHVH and El. You have some few Canaanite city-states or territories that will share these deities. They will have the same deities in their territories. And we have evidence of this because when we look at the cults of YHVH, they were highly varied. They varied so much. We see this, there's evidence of this by inscriptions that we now have from the biblical text itself and then other records that show us that territories had their own deities of similar names or similar entities. What do I mean by that? For example, you have a Yahweh of this location. You go to another location, there's a Yahweh there. You go to another territory, you meet another Yahweh. So the cults of Yahweh were highly varied. And we have these evidence. For example, when you come to Contulet Adjud, there's a text there that refers to a Yahweh of Teman and then a Yahweh of Samaria. These are localized Yahweh. So when you go to Teman in the south, there is a Yahweh there. When you come to Samaria, there is a Yahweh there. We have an inscription in Kibet Beetli where it says of a Yahweh of Jerusalem. Yahweh, God of Jerusalem. Now, we read 2 Samuel 15, and what do we see? A Yahweh in Hebron. It came to pass at the end of 40 years, and Absalom said to the king, allow me to be, I beg you, and pay my vow which I have vowed to the Yahweh in Hebron. So this Yahweh is localized in Hebron. Now we come to Psalms 99 verses 2. It mentions of a Yahweh in Zion. YHVH has reigned. Nations will quake before him. Who dwells between the cherubims? The earth will falter. YHVH is great in Zion. This YHVH, he is Zion. Zion is his territory. And then we come to Genesis 28 and we see the Yahweh that is at Bethel. Genesis 28. And Jacob left Beersheba, and he went to Haran, and he arrived at the place and lodged there, because the sun had set. And he took some of the stones of the place and placed them at his head, and he lay down in that place. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the ground, and its top reached the heaven. And behold, angels of Elohim, or God, were ascending and descending upon it. And behold, YHVH was standing over him, and he said, I am YHVH, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land upon which you are lying, to you I will give it, and to your seed. And your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall gain strength westward and eastward and northward and southward. And through you shall be blessed all the families of the earth, and through your seed. And behold, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go, and I will restore you to the land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I have spoken concerning you. And Jacob awakened from his sleep, and he said, Indeed, YHVH is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was frightened, and he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob arose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had placed at his head, and he set it up as a monument, and he poured oil on top of it, and he named the place Bethel. So this is the YHVH that is here at Bethel. Would see where it's coming from. Historically, it's coming from the days of Jeroboam. This is a theological narrative about it. So in Genesis 28:10, we see it recounts reverence for a YHVH at Bethel. So what have we seen? When I say the cults of YHVH were highly varied, we see that there is a YHVH in Samaria. We have one in Teman. We have one in Jerusalem. We have one at Hebron. There's one in Zion, and then at Bethel. We see a diversity here. And understanding the diversity of religious practices in antiquity is complex, and it usually requires looking at three distinct levels of analysis. Before we look at those three distinct levels, are there any comments, questions, contributions?